Welcome everyone to AscentData Modernization, getting your data ready for cloud analytics. We're happy to be an AWS advanced tier partner, and we're going to talk today about how to use AWS to move your data into the cloud and get some good analytics out of it. My name is Jeff Spear. I am the Director of Data Engineering at Ironside, and we're going to be talking today about the principles of modern analytics framework, design patterns for proper cloud architecture, how to make those design patterns work for each possible audience, and how you can implement that using our AscentData offering. We're going to have some benefits to AscentData that you see on the right. We're going to talk about those as we get into it. Let's do that right now. Here at Ironside, we want to help you use your data to make better decisions about your business. The modern analytics framework is one excellent way to do that. We have a number of offerings in our Ascent suite. Ascent AI helps you bring machine learning within your reach and also really realize value from machine learning, not just get algorithms that are working, but algorithms that are making a difference in your business. Ascent IQ helps you rationalize existing reporting and move it to the cloud. And AscentData we'll be talking about today is building your data and analytics in the cloud. AscentData is built on what Ironside calls the modern analytics framework. We've got a number of presentations on this. We're going to go through it very quickly now, but if you're looking for more information, we're happy to talk to you. The important thing about a modern analytics framework is that it separates knowledge workers, people who are generating insight and value for your business, from data engineers who are creating the data sets that knowledge workers use to generate those insights. And in between those two is what we call data as a service. That is the layer where you've got automated data delivery at various levels of refinement so that when someone goes to make a new report or a new algorithm or a new dashboard, they can get the data that they need in an easy way. But also, if in the process of doing that, they find some new way to represent data that's generally valuable, that new way of structuring the data gets pushed back to the data as a service layer so it's available for future people. So that's sort of the core of the modern analytics framework. And the first way that it sort of works and achieves value for you is by balancing the time and the effort you spend refining the data versus the value of using that data. And so this diagram sort of shows the different levels of data refinement that you might see in a modern analytics framework. At the bottom, you've got a data warehouse, and that's something that people had for a long time. The benefits of a data warehouse are hard to deny. You've got very, very refined data that's very easy to do analytics on. If you want to do reporting and the data warehouse has the type of data that you need, it's usually just a drag and drop process to make that report. The challenge with a data warehouse is it takes a lot of work to get there. And so a lot of organizations have seen that if they try to put all their data in a warehouse, they just spend far too much time creating the warehouse and maintaining it and changing it. And so often the warehouse gets out of date over time and quickly it becomes less used and less adopted because it hasn't kept up with new data sources and changes to existing data sources. So then at the other end, you've got the data lake, and where you just put all the data in more or less in a raw format. So it's very easy to get data in. So it's, you build a data lake, create, often in AWS, you'll use S3. You can put whatever types of data you want, structured, semi-structured, unstructured, organize it in buckets, and you've got a data lake. Very easy to get data in, but obviously it's very much harder to get analytics out. You've got data in raw formats. It hasn't been cleansed. It might have data quality issues. It might not be integrated with similar data sources. So there you've sort of got the other end of the balance where the cost to refine the data is low, but the cost to analyze it is high. And so in a modern analytics framework, you're going to have those two things, a lake and a warehouse, but you're also going to have some things in between. Sandboxes are areas where you can sort of people who are trying things out, maybe doing one-off reports, maybe doing very, sort of tight deadline reports, have the ability to create things, put data together on a temporary basis. The idea is that, they do those things and either they're done and they abandon it, or if it's useful, it gets moved to somewhere else in the framework. And that somewhere else is usually data zones. And those are areas where that balance of refinement and ease of use is sort of somewhere in between. So you might do just some basic data quality checks and publish a data zone. So people looking to do reporting don't have to go to the lake where everything is raw, but it's easy to get all the data to that level of refinement. So they have access to more data than might be in the warehouse. You might go a little bit farther. You might take multiple order systems and combine them into one table, or you might create all data relevant to sales and put it in a large denormalized table because certain types of analytics users need that kind of format. And you'll do that if the value of that data is higher. So the goal here in creating these zones is to balance the ingestion effort and the analysis effort, and then make sure that people get to the right data source based on what they need and what they like to work with. Some people will want raw data, data scientists in particular, may not want to have anything done to their data before they get a look at it, whereas business users want as much refinement as possible usually so that it's as easy as possible to create the reports that they need. The modern analytics framework is designed to be simple yet powerful. So this is another look at that previous diagram where you've got the lake on the left, you've got the warehouse on the right, and you're balancing ease of ingestion with ease of analysis. And so in between, you'll have some number of zones. How many zones you have and what the format of the zones is organization specific. It depends on what type of skill sets you have, what type of needs you have, how your data is organized. The specific zones and location of them on that spectrum is going to change for each organization. But then what you have is you have a large variety of jobs or code or what have you, moving the data from the lake to these zones to the warehouse. In this diagram, it's sort of shown as going from the lake to the zone to the next zone to the warehouse. It's entirely possible that some data transfers might bypass a zone or take more complicated routes. We diagrammed it this way just to make this a little bit easier to consume. But the important thing is that there isn't one large ETL process running all this. You've got lots of small moving parts. It's entirely possible that different organizations might be populating different parts of the zone, creating different sandboxes. And so what you're trying to do is make sure that it's easy to change any one of these things. If the data evolves, if there's a new need, it might be that a new data source comes on board, it's easily put in the lake, and someone decides this is valuable data. I want to make sure that I refine it and get it to this first zone. And so you add a fourth arrow here, moving that data source in. And so making those pieces small, make it very simple to create and maintain all this data movement, but really gives you the power of having the data that you need and refined to the level that you need it. In doing this and making this happen, you have a lot of new technologies and new design patterns. And this is really where AWS shows its strength. You've got a lot of different options for how you bring data into the lake. Typically in AWS, you'll use S3 for the lake, but that's not the absolute only choice. But in terms of data movement and data storage, you've got a lot of different choices. And so as your data gets refined, you're going to probably want to use higher performance databases to get better use out of that data because that data is higher value. If your data is very relational, it's very easy to shift to analytic databases like Redshift, or you could use RDS. If your data is more, speculative, you may keep some of these zones in S3. You may use other storage methods to keep the data in the format that it needs to be in. Similarly, in terms of moving the data, there's a whole bunch of AWS services that let you do that. So Databrew or Glue is very popular, but you can also use EMR, you can use Lambda functions, you can use Databrew, you can even use the database management service depending on some of your sources. And it's not like you have to make a single choice for these things. It is entirely possible for different parts of this system to be using different technologies based on the need. An obvious one is if you've got real-time or near real-time data, you may want to use something more with Kinesis and Lambda to bring the data in as it flows into your system, whereas other parts are more likely to be batch-based using something like Databrew, DMS, or what have you. So the point here is that you're really looking at each of these individual pieces, not the system as a whole, and allowing there to be some diversity depending on the needs based on the data and depending on the people who are maintaining it. You don't necessarily want to have the Wild West where any technology is acceptable, but it's fine to say, here are the 3 design patterns that we like to use depending on whether the data is real time or whether, if you have a Python skill set and want to use Glue, or you have a replicated database and want to use DMS. The important thing is to give you those options so that it's as easy as possible to create, maintain, and sustain this kind of framework. What you don't want is something where any change takes 3 to 6 months because everything is so complicated. Lots of small moving parts, each of which is very easy to create and maintain. It's very important to create these zones in a way that provides data for all of the audiences within your organization. It used to be that everyone sort of built for the business user or the business analyst, but now there's just more types of people that are using data within the organization. Everything from data scientists and engineers to business users and consumers. And they're all going to have different skill sets and different methods of working with the data, and they like to work with different volumes of data. And you want to make sure that you create your data zones and refine your data in such a way that as many of them as possible are getting what they need. And so what we have here are 5 common personas. They're certainly not the only ones. And each of those has a bunch of data and skills listed. Obviously, individual organizations are going to tend to focus in certain areas. You might have a ton of people who know R, or everyone knows Scala, or everyone knows Python. And you want to think about that when you set your data up. All of them go through the same process to create insights, and that's shown on the right, but they're going to use different tools in doing it. But that process involves, the first thing they're going to do is when they have a question, is they're going to try to find all of the data that pertains to the issue at hand. And this is where having a modern analytics framework is super important because it makes it easier for them to find the data that they need in the format that they need it. If you just have a data lake, then less sophisticated users are going to just probably bounce off this huge list of tables, and there's just too much data out there. It's in a raw format. It's very difficult to process. Similarly, data scientists might not be happy with a warehouse because it doesn't have enough detail or enough, sort of raw data. Features might be lost. Data might be aggregated. That identification and collection of data is particularly beneficial if you have a modern analytics framework. They're then going to take that data and transform it. Usually when you're creating an important new insight, the data that's out there isn't sufficient for what you want. So maybe you're going to integrate data sources, maybe you're going to aggregate data sources, and maybe you're going to do more complex transformations. This is where sandboxes really come into their own. So giving users the ability to make those effectively new data sources by combining existing ones somewhere where they can persist it and take a look at it and understand it and try things out and see what works and hopefully arrive at an insight. And that process is the analysis stage. And that's where hopefully this question turns into an answer. Once they've done that, that insight needs to be deployed. And what's important with the modern analytics framework is it's not just deploying the answer, but it's deploying the data that led to the answer. So if someone does a whole bunch of new transformations and creates a new way of looking at the data, and that new way is believed to be of value to the enterprise, then whatever is going in and populating its sandbox needs to be automated into one of the existing data zones or create a new data zone. But basically, not just making the report available to everyone, but making the data available to everyone in an automated fashion. And this is a problem that a lot of organizations struggle with now. People will create reports like this using manual tools like Excel or Access. And then once they've done that, they create a great report, but then they're stuck refreshing it because they use a manual tool. And so a lot of their time that could be spent generating new insights is now spent updating and refreshing these existing reports. And so by quickly identifying if this report has insight and pushing that automation to a separate team, the data team, to make sure that that data is made available in an automated, consistent fashion, it lets knowledge workers go on and create their next new insight. And then once that's happened, you're going to go back and see, are there new things to be done? Is there new analysis to be done? Sometimes when you publish data like that, you'll find data quality issues, or someone else will look at it and realize there's a better way to represent it. And so you may go through an iterative process of improving this product, which adds to the value that the data provides to the company. And so super important in this is the governance process of evaluating how valuable is this data to the organization, and therefore, how much work is it worth to automate? So if it's something that's super valuable, then it probably belongs in the warehouse. If it's a one-off report, then you may just abandon the sandbox code and not worry about it again. If it has some moderate degree of importance, then you refine the data to the extent that you need to and put it in one of those data zones. And so that process of evaluating the value of what's been done is extremely important to making a sustainable modern analytics framework. And that, I guess, sort of governance/build pattern is at the core of this concept. It's very important to do that, to think about sustaining this entire framework over the long term. It's I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's relatively easy to sort of build this the first time. It's hard to keep it working in a way that end users want to come back to. And that's because as IT people, we want this to be very static and simple, and we build it and it's the answer and it's done. And the reality is that that's just not how things work. New data sources are constantly coming in. Existing data changes over time. The pattern of data entry changes. The nature of the data itself changes. There are new data quality issues. There's always something changing. And even if the data is not changing, the business's perspective on it is going to change. The business world evolves rapidly. And so what was a less important question today becomes an important question next quarter, just based on the evolution of the market. And so this all needs to be created with the understanding that it's going to evolve and change over time. And so that's why it's super important to make sure that you can easily get all the data in and then only refine the data as much as you need to based on its value, so that if something changes, you're not doing a lot of extra work. If all of the data flows down to the warehouse, then anytime something has to change, that's a lot of code to change. It's a lot of refinement and aggregation and work that has to be examined and redone. Whereas if a lot of the data is only getting refined a little bit, well, if you have to change it, there's only a little bit of code to change. Lots of small moving parts make it easier to make those changes. It does mean that you have to have robust governance so that you sort of understand all those moving parts and make sure people know sort of the value of each and why it's there. Just like when you have more people doing something, it takes a little bit more management to keep them all moving in concert, moving in the same direction. It's the same concept here. You have smaller moving parts, a little more coordination to make those moving parts work together. The result of the modern analytics framework makes insight easier because it gets rid of data silos. The first thing you do when you're making a framework like this is you make a data lake, and that gets all your data hopefully in one place. And so, in the worst case scenario, you've got to do a report off data that no one had looked at before. At least you know that it's there. So you know that you can do the report. But hopefully, if the question, bears on something that's been identified as relevant, then that data is in a data zone or even in a data warehouse where it's got more refinement to it and even easier to generate that data. Commonly, most companies know what their core data is. If you work in the retail business, you know that sort of sales and ordering and shipping, that data is super important. So it's very likely that it's going to be in a data zone where you've sort of done the basics of combining the different systems. So you've got, customers and products and orders and warehouse information all in one place without necessarily taking it to a data warehouse. So even if there's sort of an oddball question, that data is there, and you can much more quickly come up with an answer without having to do a lot of transformations to get to that point. And so, and if that's not the case, maybe there's some new data source just came online and hasn't been incorporated yet, you've got the ability to create a sandbox and very quickly combine that data to answer the question. And then after the fact, go back and say, okay, how valuable was this? Let's go recombine that data in a more persistent way. You're enabling rapid insight generation. You are insisting on automated value delivery, and that creates that middle data as a service layer, which lets people go on to rapidly generate the next insight. The way we like to deliver this at Ironside is an offering that we call AscentData. The goal with AscentData really was to make it something where we can easily introduce people to the cloud if they're new to AWS, or introduce them to cloud analytics. We have a lot of customers who are in the cloud, but just haven't really gone over to the analytics side of it yet. And often people say is, okay, well, what does this look like in the cloud? Maybe they know, maybe they have a warehouse on premise, maybe they don't, but they don't really understand, sort of how the pieces fit together in the cloud. So we start with what we call a rapid cloud assessment, and that's just proving out this is a stack that works, based on what we understand of your organization and our experience with AWS. And this is really what the flow would look like coming in from your sources, coming into a data lake, flowing through the zones, going to a warehouse, going to a QuickSight or another visualization tool. And that's set up to deliver very quickly. So in a quick turnaround, we can show you what it looks like. And then if that makes sense, we can say, okay, let's take that and productionalize it. Let's make data pipelines that are pulling in all the relevant data and are refreshable and sustainable and create a modern analytics framework. And then, like I said, this stuff changes over time. So, we can help monitor it, we can help optimize it, we can help improve it over time. You can do sort of any or all of these steps. If you're at the beginning, great. You may say, hey, we sort of know what we want to do, but can we productionalize it? Happy to do that as well. It's a very scalable process and something that can really help you get to the cloud from an analytic perspective very easily. To sum up, when you're building cloud data and analytics on a modern analytics framework, it's important to balance the effort you spend refining the data and the effort of getting insight out of that data. That's really the core of our modern analytics framework and really the core of successful cloud analytics. It's useful to do that in the cloud. I guess you don't have to do it in the cloud, but we found it's very, very beneficial to do in the cloud because the flexibility that you get there and the ability to scale up is much nicer than on-premise. If you need a new sandbox, if you need a new data zone, it's very simple to create. If it doesn't work out, you can just get rid of it and stop paying for it. Whereas on-premise, if you want a new pre-prod environment, there's usually a lot of work in getting the hardware and configuring it, installing it, and all that stuff. And this lets you just not worry about that. It gets all your data in one place, so you don't have data silos, and so that you can get data in the right formats for the right audience. We want to help you do that with our modular approach. The important thing to remember about that is we'll happily create an AWS account for you. We'll happily work in your account or an account that you create. You already have a cloud presence, and we can manage that for as long as you want, or we can hand it off over time. Obviously, if we're building this for someone, our goal is to enable them to continue to grow and sustain it and maintain it over time. And sometimes they've got people ready to go to do that, and sometimes it takes a little bit more work. And sometimes they're like, no, we want you to keep doing it for a longer period. And we're happy to do that as well. But it's very simple to say, okay, here are the keys to the account. You have access and it's all yours. So doing this with AWS makes it much simpler, both to get started and to keep going in the long run. So that's the quick version of modernizing in the cloud with data and analytics. I'm happy to be able to talk to you about it. Would love to talk to you more. So if you have any other questions or want to dive into this or some of our other Ascent offerings, please reach out at the email address there or go to our website. We've got lots of people who'd be happy to talk to you. Thanks very much for your time and thanks for listening.